I want to talk about these three personalities because you spent time with all of them, including Bolsonaro. So we've talked a lot about Lula on this show, so maybe we'll get to him last. But before that, I mean, how did you get such access to the Workers' Party specifically?
My mother had been like an activist of the party in the early days. I had gone to rallies and things like that, but I didn't know him well at all. And so as soon as the process began and he was taken in like enforced coercion, they call, I asked to interview him. I sent him a letter, a very long letter, and also sent Dilma a letter. I asked to Moro, the other main characters of the film, and no one responded. They never read those letters. So I went then to the Brazilian Congress with our crew and started to get access to the congressmen. Bolsonaro gave me access immediately. And every congressperson I would meet, I would ask if they could help me get access to these other people. They said it was impossible. They all were all going through like the most historical moment in any of their lives. Yeah. So months on end where we were in Brasilia having no access to any of them, I finally managed to infiltrate myself into this bus full of historians that were going to visit Dilma in the presidential palace.
Oh, wow.
And that's how I got to meet her for the first time. I handed her a DVD of my first film and asked for an interview, which she granted. And from there we established a relationship where I would get more trust from her. And with Lula, months later, I already had a trailer of the film that we had edited, and I showed him that trailer. I managed to get a meeting with him in his office, showed him that trailer, explained that the film was kind of more verite style and that he wanted to accompany him. And he said, okay, if you hang around my office until night, maybe if my wife allows, you can like tag along in the car. And she did, and after 8 hours she arrived and she allowed, and I filmed with him.
And so tell us more about Dilma. I feel like that's somebody who obviously doesn't, I mean, she isn't necessarily as historical a figure as Lula, but she was the target of this impeachment. And I'll put my bias on it. What I was really struck by watching the film was that a lot of things that people say about Hillary Clinton, who I am not a fan of, would accurately apply to her. So people would say like, oh, she's really, yes, she has trouble as a politician, but she actually has an enormous amount of like personal courage, right?
Yeah.
Things I do not buy as described to Hillary Clinton, they seem to be like an exact match for Dilma. Like this is actually an extraordinary person who has a huge amount of resiliency and then got caught in this fascistic moment, I would suspect a US-backed moment, and also with a huge amount of gender dynamics and misogyny that actually got spilled over on Lula too. So could you talk more about her and just the dynamic of understanding who she was and what she was going through?
Yes. So Dilma had been a guerrilla fighter during the dictatorship. She was imprisoned for 2 years, brutally tortured, and then in the south of Brazil, got into a career where she was like a secretary of mining and energy. Lula perceived her and met with her and was impressed with her competence and invited her to join his government, first as Minister of Energy and like natural resources, then as Chief of Staff. And he would call her the mother of his government, which can be kind of misogynistic a little bit, but I think he did it in a loving way.
I have to say, he compared himself to a mother in my interview with him. So it's interesting how he uses that. He said being president is like being a mother. That was his analogy, which I don't think, I mean, maybe in 2020 with people trying to kind of posture as woke, but you would never hear that historically in the United States. So that's interesting.
Yeah, like matria.
Yeah.
And so they were very close during those years, and he attributes the success of his government a lot to her. But many ministers that had to deal with her complained that she was always extremely rough, that they didn't feel listened by her. And in an interview to me, Lula says, yes, they would complain to me and I would console them. and
You
I
get
thought,
beat off on by Dilma and you go to Papa Lula to get a little pat on the shoulder.
and he says, and I thought when she would become president, it would be different. But she got even more hard on, I think. And many people complained that they did not have a good communication with her. She starts her presidency in early 2011. And for the first 2 years, she has the highest approval rates of any president in Brazil's history, if I'm not wrong. Until in 2013, these protests begin again asking for against this rise in the bus fare. And in 1 month, her popularity drops from 70 to 30%. It was the most incomprehensible event in Brazilian history. Until today, people are still trying to understand what happened these protests of June that really shaped this far-right movement that started to take over the country, because these protests started progressive, but over time, and I believe through a lot of influence of social media, this far-right discourse started to hijack them, with people at the end asking for the return of the military, something we had never heard of in Brazilian history. I mean, since the dictatorship finished. And Dilma's popularity was then deeply hurt by that. However, she manages to get reelected the next year, even though the entire Brazilian establishment had supported the other candidate. Because I think for a few reasons, because Lula had always done, at least after he was elected, I think because it was so hard for him to get elected, he only got elected when he told the elite, no, I will not threaten any of your interests. So he did not threaten throughout his mandate, his 2 mandates, any interests of the elite. Dilma did. Not only did she lower the interest rates of the banks for a little moment, but also in the communication, she would not receive well the owner of a construction company or the owner of a huge bank. And so this malaise, this kind of uncomfortable situation started to exist between the Brazilian establishment and Dilma. And there was even a movement of people asking for Lula to come back in that election in 2014. But he decided not to. He thought it was Dilma's choice, and she chose to be reelected. However, the entire establishment went the other with ISU. ISU didn't win, so everyone went for her impeachment immediately after.
Yeah, it was something that was going to happen regardless.
Yeah.
So then we get the cause that second.
Yes.
I mean, it's funny. All of the things that Trump claims is happening to him have happened to Lula and Dilma. That's one of the funny, there was this fake investigation and illegitimate impeachment. All of this stuff actually happened in Brazil.
But here it's quite different, no?
Though it's very, well...
no? Do you see similarities?
In terms of, I mean, it's quite different. It's complicated. So his claiming that he's innocent and the investigations against him are illegitimate is ludicrous. Yeah. And everybody kind of universally understands him as some type of criminal, including people who like him. And I think that that's part of his popularity in certain quarters, right? I think the thing that's maybe more subtle and some people go overboard with is how do you actually beat him, and do you want it to simply be like a bureaucratic process that probably won't be particularly effective? And why is it that, a standard left-wing critique here would be why is it that the Democratic Party is so obsessed with Russia or Ukraine versus just very clear and very demonstrable corruption? Why not an impeachment built around the fact that he trades his hotel getting booked out for foreign policy as a normal practice, basically. And, I think and this may in some ways be analogous to Brazil as well, which is that if you get into that realm, Trump does what everybody does in a much more naked and transparent way. But there's quid pro quo across the entire system. But no, I mean, mostly it's ridiculous. It's just been very funny to watch, because every time I see Trump say, well, it's a rigged investigation and it's totally unfair, I always am thinking of Lula and Dilma, and I'm like, you think that this is happening to you, but it is not. And it's a funny analogy. So
I think Bannon and Trump have been very competent in kind of hijacking the progressive discourse in a very
Talk
efficient
about
way.
that. That's interesting. Tell me.
No, like Bannon in American Dharma, the film by Errol Morris, he says at one moment, like, we have to do the revolution before they do it. There was clearly, after Occupy Wall Street, a desire to reclaim power by the people, and we're going to offer them that because otherwise they're going to do it themselves, you know, and that they've been very efficient at creating a narrative that seems to be for the people.
Yeah, they have been, and I mean, they have the perfect opponents in most members of the Democratic Party because they can, you know, if Joe Biden is the nominee, then what do, right? Then it's going to be, yes, it's different, and sure, you know, it's ridiculous that Trump could accuse anybody else of corruption, but he doesn't care. He'll do it regardless. And then we'll sit and we'll have a several-month argument about whose kids are more corrupt and whose deals are more unsavory and who's going to win. I mean, it's not a foregone conclusion, but that kind of argument where, yes, you can basically say, and you can also flip both sides of it because they're very effective at this too. You can either do pretend fake populism, or you can kind of say on another level, okay, sure, I'm a little corrupt, but at least I'm kind of telling you that, and there's a certain entertainment to how I'll present my corruption. I mean, if you look at I haven't followed it necessarily that closely, but the evolving reactions to this, like, Ukraine phone call, you know, first, so I didn't, then it's like, yeah, basically like, yeah, I made the call and it was great.
It was a perfect
best call ever done, and I'm exposing corruption. And I think, you know, the problem here, and I'm actually curious if you could tell me if both what you think of this and if there's some similar dynamic with Bolsonaro, that he takes enough generalized disgust that people do have. Because I think people have some understanding that, like, yes, there's calls that are made and favors are traded, and oh my God, this whole thing is so disgusting, and why was Joe Biden's son doing this to begin with? And what the fuck, right? Mm-hmm. And so he can kind of play around that. And unless you have, and I think in Brazil, because I think President Lula is an incredible, like if Barack Obama did for this country what Lula did for Brazil, we would say he's the best president in the history of, like, just hands down. So they had to wage a much more relentless war against the Workers' Party than they would have to do against Democrats here. But you could see parallels with, you can take a generalized apolitical dissatisfaction with the system and corruption discourse and very easily make that fascistic because there's no class understanding, there's no analysis. But anyways, I mean, first of all, do you agree with that? And does Bolsonaro have a similar thing that he's able to do in Brazil in terms of, like, as an example, taking the things that are emerging every day, it seems like, about him and his family?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I mean, that's how the far right in Germany called communist socialists. It was by using the adjective corrupt. And it's interesting as well, even in Greece, when there was this Macedonian invasion of Greece that finished with democracy, and then they established that only those with a huge portion of land would be able to vote. The tyrant that made that invasion then said, no, I'm by this reestablishing democracy.
Right.
So consistently we've had in the history of humanity coups on democracy that are done under the guise of actually saving democracy. And it's curious that it's always about tax. It's about the rich not wanting to pay taxes and wanting to have the poor people super grateful that they do acts of philanthropy.
Yeah.
So consistently we're having the same thing. With Dilma, the impeachment started, the week it started, it was quite symbolic that one of the groups that were asking for her impeachment were also protesting against a law to tax great fortunes.
Right. Of course. And the Atlas Network, which is a Koch brothers network, was involved in this. And I mean, I guess also I'll just put it bluntly. I mean, do you see, certainly Lula and I think Dilma herself are quite overt now about them thinking that there's a U.S. role in this. it makes sense to me. Do you see that aspect of this story as well?
In 1964, when there was the military coup in Brazil, it would take ages for it to be proven that the U.S. was backing that coup. So I think it will take a while for this proof to come if it happened. But what exists right now is indications that there were corporations that were instructing and manipulating the events. As, for example, the Koch brothers that you mentioned that financed MBL, this movement, Brasil Livre, that was one of the far-right movements that was behind the impeachment, doing Facebook advertisements and garnering support for the Dilma's impeachment right after she was elected.
You just watched a Michael Brooks show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. Click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.